afternoon, and thank you for joining us on Future TV. I'm Linda Tamim, and these are today's top stories. His Excellency British Ambassador to Lebanon, Mr. Tom Fletcher, is in our studios for a Future News interview exclusive. The Geneva talks conclude with Iran indicating a willingness to scale back uranium enrichment. And U.S. President Barack Obama signs a bill ending the 2-week government shutdown and extending the Treasury's borrowing authority. Starting with an exclusive for Future News, we go on to our very own Yumna Naufal with the latest on Syria.
With great pleasure that we welcome in our studios today His Excellency, the British Ambassador to Lebanon, Mr. Tom Fletcher. Welcome, Mr. Fletcher.
Thank you, Yumna. It's great to be here.
1 in every 4 people today is a Syrian refugee in Lebanon. And politicians and analysts are saying that this is causing a crisis of all sorts on all levels. Now, I know you have previously said that the UK was one of the first countries to respond to the humanitarian crisis. And you also said that the British government has committed $275 million to this cause. So how's the aid reaching Lebanon in specifics?
Well, in fact, since I said that, the overall number of the overall amount of our contribution is now actually £500 million, of which over $100 million is being spent here just in Lebanon. So it's getting through. It's providing shelter, it's providing food, providing education for those victims of this man-made conflict. But it's also going to help host communities as well. It's not just for the refugees, but also for the Lebanese communities that are showing such generosity.
Is it reaching Lebanon? Is it allocated? Because, you know, there's constant complaints that there are no shelters. There are a lot of NGOs on the ground that are committed, that are doing some work, and we know we've heard them, such as the DNC, etc. But how is the money specifically reaching them? $500,000, you're saying?
It is reaching them all the time, and every week I get updates from DFID, who look after the UK's aid money, but also from the NGOs that are delivering that support on the ground.
So the NGOs are helping you track how the money is being...
Absolutely. And also through the UN as well. So every week we can see exactly how many people are being helped with shelter or food or education. You know, even last week in Nabatea, we piloted a new scheme with the World Food Programme, and now the refugees are receiving e-cards.
With $27 on them, which would allow them to,
which mean they can spend that money in 300 or so shops. Again, giving them the means to get access themselves to the food they need, but also minimizing the risk of money going astray here and there.
Right. We're talking 1 in 4 people today in Lebanon. We're a population of 4 million. And the war so far has only gone for 2.5 years, and there is no end in sight. I know France has agreed to take in 500 Syrian refugees at the request of the UN, following talks between French President François Hollande and UN High Commissioner for Refugees Antonio Guterres. Do you think the UK will follow in the footsteps and maybe do something similar? Because Lebanon can only accommodate so much.
I think we're all clear that Lebanon is basically facing a massive responsibility at the moment. And it's unfair of us to expect Lebanon to face that responsibility alone.
Right, so what can we do to alleviate the situation?
Which is why, well, it's why for us, we're putting so much resource. This is, you know, by a long way, the most we've ever spent on a single humanitarian situation. We have coming next week, for example, the guy in our organization to see how we can better deliver that money. But ultimately, the way to stop the humanitarian crisis is to stop the political crisis. And the best way for us to spend our time, our energy, and our resource is on trying to get some kind of political deal inside Syria to stop the fighting.
Right, but the big hope was Geneva too. And at the beginning of this week, the Syrian National Coalition announced that it would not attend the talks. Therefore, and this is Geneva 2, Geneva 1 already failed. Lakhdar Brahimi is the second Syrian envoy, international Syrian envoy, and so far there is no end in sight, and things are spinning out of control. So how do you think a political solution is going to come through?
I wouldn't describe Geneva 1 as a failure. I think Geneva 1 has set us out now with the overall roadmap, the game plan for how to get talks started. But we need to get that momentum going. I think Geneva 2 will come off. I know there's a lot of concern about who will go, who won't go. But I think what you're seeing now across the region, across the international community, is a much clearer determination, collective resolve to get the parties there, to get them there, I hope, in the course of November, by the end of November, and really start to hammer through the mechanics of what a deal looks like. You know, lots of people have criticised the Geneva process, but they don't have a better idea.
Right. There is no better idea in sight, but if you don't get all parties on the table, then how can we expect a political solution? It seems like it's a little bit elusive at the moment.
Well, that's why we accept that the regime will be represented at Geneva, but we also recognise the need for the opposition to be represented in force in Geneva.
Speaking of the opposition, according to BBC, Home Secretary Theresa May described Syria as a training ground for a new generation of British terrorists. And the head of MI5 says thousands of Islamist extremists see the British public as a legitimate target for an attack. Are you not concerned that after these British militants finish fighting in Syria, they will come back to plan another 7/7 in the UK?
Well, I think it's a major concern for all of us that Syria is becoming a magnet, really, for extremists from across the region, and across Europe as well. And it's a conflict in which people are becoming more and more radicalised, in which these groups are feeding off each other, and that's a concern for all of us, absolutely.
But your government, as well as the US government, is supporting the opposition being divided, and the rebels, a lot of them now being Al-Qaeda affiliates. So who's the real enemy? Is it President Bashar al-Assad, or is it the rebels?
I would say the real problem is both the extremists inside the regime, who have done so much to terrorize their own people, but also the extremists in the opposition. And I agree completely. You know, these groups around Al-Qaeda, Jabhat al-Nusra, you know, these wannabe Al-Qaeda types are a real threat to all of us. And again, this is why we need to find some kind of political process in which the silent majority, those who are not with the extremists either in the regime or in the opposition, are able to come together and chart a better course for Syria that holds the state together.
I know British Foreign Secretary William Hague also said that Syria remains catastrophic, yet he did welcome the fact that the destruction of its arsenal was underway. And this only means, though, that it's happening with the cooperation of President Bashar al-Assad, and it's extending his rule until mid-2014. So how do you explain that he's saying we're moving forward, and yet Assad is still part of the plan?
Look, we have to be realistic about the situation on the ground. There's a huge concern about either the regime using these chemical weapons again, or about chemical weapons falling into the wrong hands, the hands of extremists. And that is a major priority for all of us to stop that happening. And that's why the US and Russia, backed up by the rest of the international community, secured this deal that allows the inspectors in to start the process of destroying those weapons. Now, that is clearly in everyone's interest. It doesn't mean that all the other problems have gone away. It doesn't mean that it's okay for Assad to use conventional weapons on a massive scale against his own people.
Do you think the Security Council did enough? I mean, technically what they did is say, all right, this is a criminal. They're claiming that he was responsible for the August 21st attack, the gas attack, and we're going to punish him by removing his weapons, but yet he's still free to roam around. So is what they're doing, is it enough, do you think?
Well, again, we have to work within the limits of what is realistic. The British Parliament made very clear that it didn't want to support the idea of military action to rid Syria of its chemical weapons.
Why do you think that is?
They were worried about the consequences. They were worried about whether or not there was a plan that had been thought through for all the implications of that kind of action. But there was huge support for trying to stop the crisis, for trying to stop the conflict, and for trying to ensure that it's not possible for anyone to use chemical weapons on such a scale again. And look, it's at the beginning of a process. I'm not pretending that that deal is the answer, but it's the first step, and it should give us more confidence that the international community, that the Americans, the Russians and others can start to find common ground. None of us want to see a disintegration of the Syrian state. No one wants to see more humanitarian tragedy on such a scale as this. So we have to find a way to almost to drop our own narratives and find a different way of approaching the problem.
It seems that for 2.5 years, diplomats have come together, analysts have come together, politicians have come together in order to try to bring a solution to this crisis. And there is still today no solution in sight. So they're moving ahead with Geneva too. But with Assad still in power, according to the opposition, and the opposition, the biggest part of the opposition, biggest coalition group that's recognized by the international community, the SNC, deciding to not attend the convention, I'm just wondering, how do you see a solution taking place? I mean, we talk about diplomatic solution, and I think that was the whole point of not going through with the military strike from the U.S., and the U.S. brokered a deal with Russia for the arsenal to be destroyed. But again, it's not enough. The refugees are increasing, the death toll is increasing, the terrorists are, Al-Qaeda rebels are all over the place. It's a complete mess. So who's going to help? How is it going to come about? What do you think?
Well, this is why it is so urgent to get the parties to Geneva. There is not, as you say, there is no military solution. Neither side is going to win this. And I think they both recognize that. And they both recognize the cost of continuing down this track. And certainly those of us outside recognize that very, very clearly, which is why we're prioritizing this Geneva process.
Do you think something positive will come out of Geneva too?
I think we'll see further steps in the right direction. I wouldn't want to set the bar too high.
What do you consider further steps in the right direction?
Most important thing for me is that we establish some kind of decent process, credible process, through which elements of the regime and elements of the opposition are able to identify common interests in Syria's interests.
Do you think Assad will stay?
I think that's a question for the Syrian people. Now, we all have our own views on whether it's a good thing or not for Syria.
Do you think it's a good thing for Syria?
But ultimately, it's not. I don't have a vote.
You don't have a vote. But do you think it just seems that he's not going to go anytime soon?
We'll see.
Part of the negotiating process.
We'll see. At some stage, there will need to be an election next year, and democracy has to take its path, take its course. I think the Syrian people are hugely frustrated, ground down, terrorized by what's been happening to their country, and it's for them to choose whether they want a change of leadership or a continuation. I know for certain that people want to see the Syrian state continue, and they want to see some kind of return to normality as quickly as possible.
That's the hope, I guess. For the first time since the fall of the Soviet Union, we've seen Russia playing a key role in brokering the solution to destroy President Assad's arsenal. Do you think, and it's changing the game, the rules of the game, do you think the rules have changed since the Cold War? Is this the first time the rules have changed since the Cold War?
That's quite a broad sweep of history. Clearly, we're in a different...
Do you think this could be a new Cold War?
Clearly, we have a very different relationship now with Russia to the relationship we had at the time of the Cold War. I think there's a definite change of rules from, say, 2 years ago. Over the last 2 years, until September this year, the Security Council failed completely. Failed on the Middle East, failed on Israel-Palestine, failed on Syria, failed really to generate any real momentum on Iran. And suddenly, in the last 2 months, we have what I think is the beginnings of potentially the most exciting period in diplomacy for a generation. That's a real opportunity, and it means all of us coming together, from the Americans across to the Russians, from the Iranians across to the Saudis, and trying to have a discussion about what's really in the interests of the people of this region. And I think people in this region want 3 things. They want security, justice, and opportunity. All the rest is detail.
And that's the hope for what is to come.
I hope so, and I hope that it's going to take a big effort, and we all have to be realistic about the time, the energy that needs to be put into this. But I think we also have to be conscious of the danger to all of us if we don't engage, if we don't get it right. As you said, the rise of extremism, the humanitarian cost of this conflict, these are not things we can simply ignore. These are not things we can hope will go away. We have to be in there. We have to roll up our sleeves and get stuck in to fixing this conflict.
And hopefully all this talk will materialize into something, because so far for 2.5 years it's just been talk. So we're hoping.
Well, it hasn't just been talk, because it's also been real resource
with the Geneva
to help the
too.
victims.
That's true.
I mean, some countries are supplying the arms that are fueling the conflict. Some countries like ours are actually helping the victims of the conflict. And we need to all get in that mindset of how do we actually prevent there being more victims. And that solution is political, it's not military.
Thank you so much for being with us today, Mr. Ambassador. That was the UK Ambassador to Lebanon, His Excellency, Mr. Tom Fletcher. Back to you, Linda.
Thank you, Yumna. And coming up next, an online raffle is offering Picasso lovers a chance to own one of his original works. Stay with us for more. Welcome back, and now we move on with news around the world in brief. The latest round of talks between Iran and world powers have concluded in Geneva, Switzerland, with Iran indicating a willingness to scale back uranium enrichment, as well as allowing for snap inspections of its nuclear sites as part of a new proposal to end a decade-long standoff with world powers. EU Foreign Policy Chief Catherine Ashton says world powers have agreed with Iran to continue their nuclear talks on November 7th and 8th in Geneva. Congress has passed a measure to avert a threatened U.S. default and reopen the federal government, a move intended to end a prolonged fiscal crisis that gripped the United States and threatened the world economy. The deal, however, offers only a temporary fix and does not resolve the fundamental issues of spending and deficits that divide Republicans and Democrats. An online raffle is offering Picasso lovers a chance to own one of his original works for just €100. The work is entitled Man with Opera Hat and is valued at about $1 million. The raffle's proceeds will go towards the preservation of the ancient city of Tyre in Lebanon, a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Only 50,000 tickets will be sold, and the winning ticket will be drawn at an auction house in Paris on December 18th and broadcast live on the internet. And on that note, we end our bulletin for today. Now for a recap of our headlines. His Excellency British Ambassador to Lebanon, Mr. Tom Fletcher, is in our studios for a Future News interview exclusive. The Geneva talks conclude with Iran indicating a willingness to scale back uranium enrichment. And finally, U.S. President Barack Obama signs a bill ending the 2-week government shutdown and extending the Treasury's borrowing authority. That's it from us here at Future Television. Catch us again tomorrow, same time, for more of the world's top stories. Have a great evening.